Good afternoon, everybody. I'm really excited to be able to join you this afternoon. Also, thank you, Minister Joshua, for your great and heartfelt, sincere presentation. I have the pleasure of being able to share with you this incredible information about universal principles, as Joshua has been hinting at. So I hope that you'll enjoy this time that we spend together. So this session is focusing on principles of peace, the foundation for strong families and a better world. In the previous session, Joshua was introducing Father and Mother Moon, and everything we're going to be talking about in this session today are principles that come from their teachings. We're going to be studying their teachings. So let's begin with the question, why are principles so important? You know, in everything we do, we need to be able to first understand the principles that are involved if we want to succeed. For example, if you're going to build a house, you probably want to study the principles of construction before you go ahead and build that house. If you were going to ask me to build your house, which I don't suggest you do, because if you did ask me to build your house, it might turn out something like this. And that's because I don't know anything about building a house. And principles, these kinds of principles are involved in all areas of our life, and we need to know them in order to be successful. Let's think about electrical work. While we're putting me out there, would you want to hire me to do your electrical work? Probably not, because if you did, we might end up with a situation like this. So the whole universe is governed by such principles. It's able to exist and function because of these principles, and we commonly call these the laws of nature. This applies to everything, our ability to create a plane that will fly, baking, or performing surgery. We need to know the principles of something before we do it. Like when I was a newlywed and I'm going to invite my in-laws over for the first meal I ever made them, I probably really want to study how to cook that meal before I do it, right? Or have you ever brought home some furniture from the store that you're going to build for yourself and you think you know how to do it? Later on, you regret it and you wish you had studied those principles, those directions before you began to build it. So this means that we can dream of peace and we can see peace in nature, but is it enough? No. If we want to have peace in our lives and in our homes, we need the principles of peace. We need to understand them and we need to live by them. Let's look at this quote from Kofi Annan, the former UN Secretary General. Universal values are also more acutely needed in this age of globalization than ever before. But what are these universal principles? We've been talking about them, so let's discuss a little bit more. What are the criteria for such principles? If they're so needed, as the quote we read from Kofi Annan, how do we figure them out? I propose to you that these principles need to be universal. Number one, they must apply everywhere, whether that's Africa, Asia, or America, anywhere. And number two, they must apply in the past, present, and future. They need to be scalable. They must be true on each level, whether for the individual, the family, society, nation, and world. And they must apply in all cultures and religions. In other words, universal principles, when practiced, will benefit us all, no matter our culture or religious affiliation, whether we're Christians, Jews, Muslims, members of other faiths, or just people of conscience. Evidence that such universal principles exist can be found in the World Scripture text. This is a fascinating book and was inspired by Father and Mother Moon. It draws from 323 sacred texts and oral traditions from various faiths, and they end up showing 164 themes that they all share in common. It's fascinating, isn't it? So back to our universal principles. The fifth point about what makes them universal is that these principles must be scientific, logical, and simple. They must be principles that any person could understand. So genius is not just about creating principles. The principles of the universe and the world, they already exist. They're already there. Instead, genius is about discovering and explaining them. Take, for example, Isaac Newton and his discovery of gravity. He was able to draw attention to and explain the obvious. Did he invent gravity? No, but he came to explain the obvious. In this sense, Father Moon and his wife Mother Moon are true geniuses. He did not create these principles. They've been around for a long time, but what he has managed to do is help us see them in a new light, in a way that makes them empowering, able to provide real solutions to the problems that we're facing. So we've been talking about these universal principles for a few minutes now, and I'm sure you're eager to know what they are. Shall we get into it? What are these universal principles? At this point, we will identify two most fundamental principles. The first is called the dual purpose principle. It's what we're going to refer to as the pillar of our existence. The pillar refers to this vertical relationship between our mind, which includes our inner spirit, and our body. The second principle is the paired system principle. We associate it with what we call the beam, referring to this horizontal relationship between a man and a woman in marriage. So let's first consider the pillar, the dual purpose principle. We each have two purposes, and one is connected to our body, and the other is connected to our mind or our spirit, but they're not the same. Your body's purpose is basically to take care of itself, which is important, but if it's left to its own desires, it would just want to eat, sleep, have sex, survive, and basically do as little work as possible. I know for me, if I only listened to my body, I'd end up watching a lot of Netflix and eat a lot of junk food. But your mind is different. Within each of our minds, we have what we call our conscience. And what does our conscience do? It tells us that we have another purpose, one that's of a higher dimension. Basically, it tells us that we need to live a life of goodness by living for the greater good. The key element of the dual purpose principle is that we must prioritize the greater purpose over our individual desires. Our body is important, but it's not as important as living for the greater good. This is the dual principle. And it's not only true for people, it's actually true in all things. Let's take a look. For example, in a school, for a school to be successful, the teachers and the students need to put the greater purpose, the goals of the school, ahead of their own personal desires. At the same time, the school exists to provide for each individual's unique needs. For a business to succeed, the same is true. Managers and workers need to put the greater good of the business first. And at the same time, the business needs to take good care of its workers. And for a nation to succeed, the leaders and citizens need to all put the greater good of the nation first, while at the same time protecting the human rights of each individual citizen. The dual purpose principle is not only true for humans and the relationship between our mind and body. Similar to humans who have mind and body, particles, atoms, molecules, plants, and animals all have an inner guiding force and outer body. Let's look at it. For particles, atoms, and molecules, the guiding force comes from the natural laws of the universe. The life of a plant is also guided by the laws of nature, and animals are guided by their instinct. Now, you may ask how the dual purpose principle applies to all these things. Particles have the power for their self-existence, but they also have a greater purpose, which is to form atoms. Atoms have the power needed for their self-existence, but they too have a greater purpose to form molecules. And molecules, which you can see the trend here, right, have the power to self-exist, but they serve the greater purpose. They provide for the substance of all things, including life, both plant and animal life. And plants and animals have their self-purpose to survive, but they also exist for a higher, greater purpose through their interaction of the greater ecosystem and our planet. They provide the environment. And all of this is what makes it possible for us human beings to live, experience, and appreciate the wonders, the beauty, and the joy of creation. We all have this dual purpose principle. So let's go back to it and ask a critical question. What does it mean to be good? Can we find a universal definition of goodness, one that we can all agree with, without violating anyone's conscience or religious tenets? Father and Mother Moon actually offer a definition for this goodness that I think you might appreciate, and it's to live for the sake of others. This principle is the most universal of all principles. In fact, we find it working within the conscience of each and every person, although we may choose to ignore it sometimes. Consider this situation. There are 10 people in a group. 9 of them care nothing about others, and they're only thinking, how can I use this group of people to benefit myself? But one of them is thinking, how can I bring benefit to each person in this group? No matter what religion or culture you're from, if you're asked who in this group exhibits goodness, you will point to the one who cares and acts in the best interests of others. Isn't that true? Let's look at marriage. Let's say there's a marriage where a man and woman are selfish and they're both seeking to gain personal benefit from the other. If you compared such a marriage to a one where a man and woman live for the sake of each other, this definition of goodness, seeking to bring benefit to each other, and you're asked the same question, which one do you think is a good marriage? Think for yourself, which one would you choose? The answer is universally the same. The one that's living for the sake of others is the one we would define as a good marriage. So this theme, living for the sake of others, can actually be found throughout the religious spectrum. These are 2 biblical quotes. Let no one seek his own good, but the good of his neighbor, from 1 Corinthians. And from Matthew, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Many of us maybe have heard these before. But the same theme can be found throughout all religions. Jesus gave the highest example of living for the sake of others by giving his life for the sake of others. In Judaism, we can read from the Talmud, all men are responsible for one another. From African traditional religions, one must have the courage to face life as it is, to go through sorrows and always sacrifice oneself for the sake of others. From Father Moon, a true life is a life in which we abandon our private desires and live for the public good. This is a truth taught by all major religious leaders, past, present, East, and West. And from Martin Luther King Jr., life's most persistent and urgent question is, what are you doing for others? So we can see this theme in all religious situations. So we can conclude that to live and to give ourselves for the sake of others is good. Can we use this as our definition of goodness? With that in mind, let's go back to the dual purpose principle and ask the question, who are these others? Who is it that we live for? Our first other after we're born into this world is who? It's our mother and our father, our parents. After them, we have our brothers and sisters, and it's actually in the family that we shape and establish the pillar of our being, our true sense of self. When within the family, we establish the pillar of our being in the unity of our mind and our body, with the heart to make our parents happy, we call this child a good filial son or daughter. But the creation of our pillar, the principle of living for the sake of others, does not stop within our family. We have to take it even further. With our family together, the heart that wants to live for the sake of others, to serve the greater good, we seek to make our community better. In doing so, we become a good member of the community. And then next, based on this same principle, our community will want to serve the greater good of the nation. And as we seek to make our nation a better nation, we become good citizens. So what's next? Next is the world. Imagine a world where all the nations were living with this kind of thinking, and to be a person who makes the world a better place. But there's something in life greater than the world. There's the very source of the origin of life, of our purpose, of the world and all humanity. Some call it God, some call it Jehovah or Yahweh, some call Allah, some call it the Divine Spirit or Holy Spirit. But we would like to offer a term that we believe can be understood by all, a term that everyone can relate to, which is Heavenly Parent. All of us, in one way or another, were raised by parents or someone who stood as this kind of parent figure in our life. Again, this is why the family is so important. We learn about the heart of a parent in the family, the heart of a true parent that loves all their children. Now, I want to take a minute here to pause for a moment and recognize that in today's world, many parents are not good role models. And in some cases, parents do great harm to their children. We're not here to judge anyone for their past mistakes or to pretend that in this fallen world, anyone had ideal parents. But even if we may have had parents with serious problems, the reason that we know they had serious problems is because deep within our own hearts, we have an image of what a true parent ought to be. We know how true parents ought to behave. Therefore, when it comes to the concept of a heavenly parent, we're asking you to tap into your inner sense of what a true parent is. So when we connect with this heart, the heart of a heavenly parent, we become a good child of the heavenly parent who loves and values all people. These are the vertical relationships that enable us to become a true pillar. We have been talking about pillars. They are erected first when we're building things. And if they're true, if our vertical alignment centered on our conscience is firmly established, then we can begin to add the beams. When a man and woman understand the dual purpose principle, when their conscience is clear, when they have learned the joy that comes when we live for the sake of others, putting the greater purpose before our individual purpose, then they will stand as a true person, a true pillar. Now, from that point, they're qualified now to form a beam. This is the relationship between a man and a woman that culminates in marriage. And such a marriage will be founded on true love, the love that seeks the happiness of the other. They're living for the sake of each other. Such a couple, when they have children, what kind of children would they have? They'll be able to be the kinds of children who are good representatives to Heavenly Parent. As parents, they'll be able to raise their children to become true pillars themselves, children who grow up to embrace true love. And with such parents in such a family, the children will learn to find joy in living for the sake of others. It's a beautiful ideal, isn't it? The relationship between this husband and wife, who are each their own pillars, is the basis for our second principle, which we call the pair system principle. The most important quality of this relationship is that the couple practice true love, which we're defining as living for the sake of the other. In doing so, they will naturally remain faithful and true. So let's take a closer look at the pair system principle, this principle that creates the beam. This is not only a phenomena found with humans between man and woman. We see this principle as at work throughout the entire natural world. All things exist in a pair relationship. Particles, atoms, and molecules, the building blocks that form the substance of all things. They exist in paired relationships based on the attractive power of positive and negative electrical charges. In the plant world, we see a similar relationship, for example, the stamen and pistil of a flower. And in the animal world, there's male and female. Not only can we see this in nature, actually, this pair system is embedded in our entire culture. We see it in the fact that every religion honors marriage in their unique, beautiful, and colorful ways. We see this expressed in Scripture. From Genesis, so God created humankind in his own image. In the image of God, he created him, male and female, he created them. From Pope Francis, the image of God is the married couple, the man and the woman, not only the man, but not only the woman, but both of them together. When a man and a woman celebrate the sacrament of matrimony, God, as it were, is mirrored in them. This is God's design. It's beautiful. From Mother Moon, We marry in order to resemble God. God exists as a being of dual characteristics. Thus, husband and wife together reflect God's original nature. So if this is true, let's look at why. Why are all these things created in pairs? The general term we will use for this paired relationship found in all things is subject and object partner. The important point is the relationship that takes place between these two. It's the relationship between subject and object partner that make existence, action and reproduction possible for all things that exist. Take, for example, a honeybee. The honeybee is only able to exist because its little honeybee brain is interacting and guiding the different parts of its bodies, its eyes, its wings, its legs, and so on. In addition, it's able to exist because inside that little bee is its organs, such as its heart and muscles and digestive system. They're all interacting with each other. If they didn't do this, what would happen? The bee would quickly die. Also in this picture, you see the flower. The flower is only able to exist because within it, the cells are interacting. The fluids are interacting with the cells. The roots, the stems, the leaves, they're all interacting. And the stamen and the pistil within the flower are interacting. Without all this interaction, the flower could not exist. And then there are the relationships between the bee and the flower and the flower and the bee, the relationship between the flower and the sun and with the air and so on. Everything is able to exist only because of the relationships of giving and receiving that are going on between the various subject and object partners that exist. And reproduction is an example. Where did these cute little elephants come from? If the mama and the papa elephant didn't have a little giving and receiving action going on, then there would be no baby elephant, right? It is through these relationships of giving and receiving that the beings of life are created. We see this most clearly in a family. The husband in this picture can only be a husband because he has a wife. And the wife can only be a wife because she has a husband. They can only be parents if they have children. And children can only be children if, you guessed it, if they have parents. And the grandparents in this picture can also only be grandparents if they have grandchildren. This is why relationships are so important. The value of each position is fulfilled through their unity that comes about through giving and receiving. But today, the tendency is for people to think according to a culture of selfishness, which is contrary to this point we're making about living for the sake of others. They think I can be happy by myself. My happiness is more important than anything else. Give to me first, and then I will think about giving back. And that if they do give, only to give the very minimum so they can survive. But such an approach that wants to first take and not give will actually destroy relationships and then destroy all things. This is a culture of selfish individualism, which we can see throughout our entire world and our culture. Let's look at this quote from Father Moon. The desire to benefit yourself the most is natural, but if it motivates you to take, it is selfish and wrong. You must understand that to benefit yourself the most, you must give. Give your whole self to others. Then this desire to benefit yourself is good. This simple change will bring a new world order. Imagine if we had a world that embraced this type of thinking. The principle of true love is to give first and then receive later. This is the opposite of what we were talking about for selfish individualism. And actually, it's even to forget what you have given. Unprincipled love, on the opposite, it takes first, and then it might give back, or even it might forget to give. It's the complete opposite. To live for my own sake, even at the sacrifice of others, is to be selfish. Selfishness is what creates all of the problems in our world. Let's consider this sad example. In order to make money, the owners of this passenger boat put extra cargo on the top of the boat, which was much more than was legally permitted. And as a result, it capsized. and it killed 304 people who were mostly school-age children going on a special cruise. How heartbreaking. This selfishness is what brings corruption wherever it's present. And we can see this in our communities when we look at the situation of drugs and in discrimination of people because of their race. We see this kind of corruption in the government. People with money can buy favors or have greater influence. We see this corruption in business, in our pollution and abuse of employees by their employers. There's certainly corruption in education, where we're teaching to advance personal agendas and the failure to provide for education of the character as well. There's corruption in art, where true art is replaced by trash and pornography and filth. And of course, there's corruption in the home, which Joshua was talking about. Selfishness leads to divorce, rebellion of children, and infidelity. So let's ask ourselves this question. If we're talking about the importance of living for the sake of others and giving true love, why give? It's because love comes from my object partner, not from me. It's common sense if you think about it. You don't get love just from yourself. It comes from others. And so if we want to receive love, what do we need to do? We need to invest our love in others. So let's look at the keys to having a healthy community. You need good management, which is learned in school, but that's actually number 2. Much more important than that is to learn public-mindedness, the principle of contributing towards the greater good, living for the sake of others, which is what we were meant to learn growing up in our families. The family is important because it is our first school. It's the school of love, which Father Moon talks about here. The family is the school where love for humanity is taught and learned. When children who are raised in the warm love of their parents go out into the world, they will care for people in difficulty in the manner they learned in their home. People raised in loving relationships with their own brothers and sisters will go into society and share their caring hearts with their neighbors. People raised in love will look upon each person they meet in the world as a member of their own family. So, in summary, for any building to stand, for any nation, government, school, or business, for any institution to exist, the pillars and the beams must be true. Otherwise, the building will eventually collapse. And the place where our pillars and our beams are first set is in the family. We learned about the dual purpose principle, that true happiness comes when centered on our conscience, we're able to live for the greater good, for the higher purpose. This is what enables us to become our true self. It is the pillar of our existence. And when a man and a woman become such pillars by themselves, they'll be able to fulfill the pair system principle, and they'll be able to practice true love, to live for the sake of others in their marriage. Such a marriage will be strong, beautiful, and everlasting. It will be the source of their greatest joy. To conclude this session, I want to go back to the beginning of human history. We don't know the exact point in time when our first ancestors lived on this earth, but according to the study of human DNA, there is evidence that we all came from a single mother, possibly as far back as 200,000 years. And according to this scripture, our first common ancestors were named Adam and Eve. Earlier, we introduced this concept of God as a heavenly parent, this universal term. But now if we imagine the first man and woman had each become a true pillar, like we've been talking about, if they had put the dual purpose principle into practice in their life by putting God first, loving God with all their heart, soul, and mind, if they had kept that commandment, they would have been qualified to love each other as husband and wife, and they would have joined together in marriage with Heavenly Parents' blessing. Their marriage would have been the first true being, the first true marriage founded on actual true love. And in that case, their children would have been born out of true love. They would have been raised in true love, and they would have carried that true love into their future families. This was the original plan of creation, that the first family, the beginning point of all people and all civilizations, would be a family of true love. And then from that family, there would have emerged a community of true love, a nation of true love, and ultimately a world of true love. If this had happened, all people in the world today would be living as one family under God. And then the world would be at peace. But sadly, as we know, this did not happen. I mean, look at the evidence of the world today that we went over in this last presentation. The biblical story tells us that the first couple sinned and they were cast out of Eden. And then the first family, rather than being centered on true love, began centered on self-centered love. This has impacted communities, nations, and the world. We see it in our lives today. And instead of peace, what do we have? We have division, conflict, and pain that touches every single person's life. So to deal with and to fix this situation is the purpose of the blessing ceremony and the 43-day journey to restore true love. In the concluding session today, we will introduce the blessing and why it is significant. We will also reveal the source of self-centered love and the steps that we can take to restore true love. So I hope you'll stick with us because you don't want to miss the ending of this session. Thank you so much.